Hello friends, in the series which we are doing on history of India from 1700 to 1950, we will talk about the rise of communal politics and partition of India. In the earlier two lectures which we talked about the rise of communal politics and the partition of India, we talked about the background of the 1930s and some of the events which were associated with 1940s as well. And when you talk about the rise of communal politics, beginning from the rise of the Muslim League in 1905 when it was established, and how over a period of time Muslim League, which was a non-entity in the sense of the Indian politics, and how British or the colonial rulers, they hobnobbed with the Muslim League, and Muslim League was trying to seek more and more concessions from them, and over a period of time we find that how Muslim League became some kind of a mammoth in the Indian politics, in the sense that they were demanding partition, and for that they were ready in that sense to take on the various political parties which were there, and at the same time how British, they were also supporting the Muslim League in their endeavours. So in the earlier lectures we talked about that kind of a background where how Muslim League played an important role in that kind of a demand of the partition of India, and how the communal politics during that particular period also played an important role. And when we tend to see that how various political parties, they were being positioned at that point of time, what kind of demands they had, and how the British, they came up with different kinds of initiatives at different points of time, which we discussed some of them in the earlier lecture as well. And we were also talking about how during that particular period the Muslim League in 1940 talked about a resolution demanding the partition of the country in the framework which is referred to as the Lahore Resolution. And we see that how over a period of time such kind of policies they impacted the unity of India. And in that series we find that August Declaration was another in 1940s when Winston Churchill took over as the British PM, and Lord Linlithgow, he announced a new scheme at that point of time which was containing largely the suggestions which were given by Churchill, and it was talking in the framework of the Dominion status, and we find that it also underlined a veto by the minorities or any future constitution. And it also stated that power could not be transferred to a government whose authority was largely denied by large and powerful elements in India's national life as well. So we see that how a league over a period of time was officially recognized as the representative voice of the Muslims, even though its performance in the last elections hardly substantiated this kind of a claim, and promised that no political settlement would be made unless it was acceptable to the League. So this was some kind of a blanket power of veto which Jinnah was to use to good effect after the war had ended. And we also see that over a period of time whatever kind of initiatives which were there with regard to the issue of India. Cripps mission was another in 1942 where Stafford Cripps, who was a Labour Party leader with friendly links with many of the leaders of the Congress, he headed a mission to India whose declared intention was earliest possible realization of self-government in India. And when you talk about the provisions of the offer which were there, they belied the declaration by Cripps, because Dominion status, not full independence, was promised in that as well, and that too after the war. And the people of the princely states, they were to be represented in proposed constituent assembly by nominees of princes. So we find that how British, they were also not very clear in terms of what they were ready to give, though they made these kinds of declarations, but it was also very clear that Britain would retain control over defence in the new Executive Council as well. And Congress could have hardly accepted what was, according to the Secretary of State Emery, conservative, reactionary and limited offer. So we find that when this kind of offer was made, and how the Quit India movement was also launched after this, and we find that Indians, they were ready to fight for their independence. And Gandhi also gave the call for do or die in this particular kind of a movement, and he was also ready to in a way ignore the kind of violence which took place at different points of time. And we find that when you talk about Cripps proposal, how they brought in Pakistan through backdoor via local option clause, and the provinces were given right to sign individual agreements with Britain about their future status should they choose to reject a new constitution that would be framed. So we find that Cripps mission was not successful, it failed, and how the proposals, they gave a fillip to the activities of the Muslim League, and it also provided legitimacy to Pakistan's demand by accommodating it in their provision for provincial autonomy. And when we see that at a time when demand had hardly been taken seriously by Indians, its sympathetic consideration by officialdom was a great service to the cause of Pakistan. So we find that how British, they were continuing with their divide and rule policy which they were doing earlier as well, and how they were in a way trying to appease Muslim League, how they were trying to in a way give in to the demands which were made by the Muslim League, how they were ready to accept Muslim League as some kind of a representative of the Muslims of India. So such kind of an attitude of the colonial government was not in a good taste, and at the same time it also reflected the kind of policy which they had been following from earlier time, that is the divide and rule. And we find that how Muslim League in that sense was in a way getting that kind of support from the officialdom. And we find that during over a period of time we see that different kinds of activities or different kinds of events they unfolded. And during this particular period we find the Shimla conference and elections, and at the end of the Second World War we find that at the initiative of the Viceroy Wavell, Congress leaders, they were being released from the jail, and they were invited to Shimla to work out an interim political agreement under which Indians would be responsible for running the country. And we find that how the leaders, they were ready to cooperate and gave in list of nominees as well, but Jinnah decided to test power of veto given to him by the British, and he insisted that League alone had the right to nominate Muslims to the Executive Council. So this kind of attitude of Muslim League, Jinnah, was not conducive for any kind of peace talks, was not conducive for any kind of new constitutional developments, and we find that it was also embarrassing for the government as well. And as this denied representation to Muslims of the Unionist Party of Punjab, which had supported the British staunchly throughout the war. But we find that the present and the future interests, they were considered more important than the past loyalties, and we will prefer to announce the breakdown of the conference rather than bypass the League. And the Jinnah's power to veto the constitutional progress had been upheld as well. So we see that such kind of tactics which were being employed by the League, and how also League was interested in disseminating the idea of Pakistan to the larger masses, and how it also indulged in various kinds of calls to the Muslims to in a way going for a separate state. Then only they will be able to defend themselves. And they saw that how Congress was a Hindu body, and it was the representatives of Hindus, and how Muslim League was the sole representative of the Muslims. So such kind of a scenario at that point of time we find. And when we see that when the elections, they were being held in the winter of 45-46 to the central and the provincial legislative assemblies, they were fought by League with a straightforward communal slogan. A vote for the League in Pakistan was a vote for Islam. And mosques, they were being used for the election meetings, and Peeds, holy men, they were persuaded to issue fatwas or the directives that Muslims must vote for the League. So how Muslim League mobilized Muslims, and how Muslim League in a way talked about this kind of an idea, that how when a vote for League in Pakistan would be given, then it was a vote for the Islam. So such kind of a claim, or such kind of appeals which were made by the League for Islam, they were there. And Muslim League very well realized that they had to mobilize the masses, and once they will be able to secure more seats, then only they will be able to show their strength, and they will be able to secure a separate homeland for themselves. And when you talk about that, what kind of a scenario, what kind of a situation was being created in terms of Congress and the League, was that when you talk about, if one was voting for League, then one was voting for Quran, and if one was voting for Congress, then one was voting for Gita. And it was a small wonder then that League made a clean sweep of the Muslim seats. So this kind of a communal propaganda by the Muslim League, where they were able to Congress in many of the seats during that time. And we also see that how some of the leaders of the Congress, over a period of time, they also realized that partition was the choice which they had to make, and they would not be able to keep the country unified, because some of them they had their own ambitions in terms of apart from the seeking independence. Some of them they had their own ambitions to secure the various positions of power. So we find that the cabinet mission by early 1946, when it came, the British authorities had concluded that a graceful withdrawal from India was the best option for them. And when cabinet mission was sent to India in 46 to establish a national government and work out a constitutional agreement for the transfer of power, then we find that British there decided to leave. It was believed that the old policy of divide and rule would no longer be suitable. So when cabinet mission came to India, and when the kind of provisions which were unfolded by the cabinet mission at this point of time, we find that even that failed in India. And the kind of strategies which were followed by the British after Indian subcontinent, after the independence, it could be argued that it would have been better served if India was united. So we find that it was believed that a united India, which was friendly with Britain, could be an active partner in defense of Commonwealth, where a divided India's defense potential would be weak, and conflict between India and Pakistan would frustrate the joint defense plans. But we find that how British, when they were not able to control the situation, how the partition violence unfolded, how the migrations of people they took place, how the preponement of the partition and independence also played an important role, that initially British decided that they would walk out from India, they would withdraw from India in June 1948, but finally they withdrew from India in August 1947, preponing their withdrawal. So this was also one of the reasons where we find that British, they were not prepared in that sense. They were not able to place the system in place where such kind of violence, migration, atrocities, they would not be there. And we also see that British Prime Minister Attlee, he declared in 1946 that a minority will not be allowed to place a veto on the progress of majority. So we find that there was a change in some kind of an attitude of the colonial government. Initially at that point of time, they were saying that now they were saying that minority will not allowed to place a veto in that sense on the progress of the majority. But despite that, when we tend to see the kind of developments which were taking at this time, because earlier we have seen that in Shimla conference, as I told you earlier, where Jinnah was being allowed to wreck the conference by his insistence on nominating all the Muslims. So this was some kind of a break from the earlier policy which was followed by the British, and we find that cabinet mission, it believed that the Pakistan would not be viable as a separate entity. Therefore, the plan was that was drawn up by mission was to safeguard the interests of the Muslim minority within the overall framework of the unity of the country. And when you talk about the various kinds of provinces which were there, like Madras, Bombay, UP, Bihar, central provinces, and Orissa, which were the Congress provinces where Congress was in majority, then they would form Group A. Punjab, Northwestern Frontier Province, and Sindh would go into Group B, and Bengal and Assam would make up Group C. And a center would be there, and that center would in a way look after the defense, foreign affairs, and communications. And a province could leave group to which it was assigned after first general election, and after 10 years it could demand modification of both group and union constitutions. So we find that such kind of measures, they had a lot of ambivalence with regard to the grouping of the provinces, and Congress and Muslim League, they were at loggerheads, they were at disagreement, they had disagreements over the issue of the grouping. And we find that Congress demand was that provinces should have option not to join a group at very beginning rather than wait till general elections was held. So Congress raised this issue also, this objection, keeping in mind the Congress ruled provinces of Assam and Northwest Frontier Province, which had been placed in section C and B. And we find that League had a different kind of a design in that sense, and it demanded that provinces be given right to modify union constitution immediately and not wait for 10 years. So we find that there was a difference of opinion with regard to what Congress as well as the League believed, and we find that the basic problem was that the cabinet mission deliberately refused to clarify this stand even when asked to do so. This was because of the hope that their ambivalence might reconcile irreconcilable position of Congress and League, but in effect it only complicated the matters at that point of time. And we find that over a period of time it also became obvious that the League and the Congress, they were at cross purposes in their interpretation of the cabinet mission plan, and both of them, they saw it as a confirmation of their stand. And when you talk about the individual leaders, we find that how Sardar Patel drew satisfaction from the fact that Pakistan was now out of picture and League's power of veto had been withdrawn. And we also see that how League made it clear in 1946 6th June statement that it accepted plan insofar as the basis of Pakistan was implied by the clause of compulsory grouping. So we find that such kind of ambivalence which was there with regard to the issue of grouping, it continued despite clarifications being sought from the colonial government. And Nehru, he explained in his speech to All India Congress Committee on 7 June 1946 that Congress Working Committee had only decided that Congress would participate in Constituent Assembly, and since Assembly was a sovereign body, it would formulate the rules of procedure as well. And when you tend to understand these kinds of developments, we find that the implication was that rules laid down by a mission could be amended. League, whose acceptance of plan in any case had been qualified, quickly took the advantage of the statement or the speech of Nehru to withdraw its acceptance of the mission plan on 29 July 1946. And we find that when you tend to understand these developments in the political scenario and the kind of international situation which was also unfolding at that point of time, that both USA and USSR were also in favor of granting independence to India, and we find that the balance of power had also changed during this particular period, where we find that the dominance of Britain had declined after the Second World War, and the two superpowers, USSR and USA, both of them, they were dominating the world affairs, and both of them, they felt that it was the time was ripe for India's independence, and how the colonial countries, they should in a way grant independence to all these colonial nations. And we see, when you talk about the elections of 1946 and the popular opinion, League used the British compulsion to join to justify a constitutional deadlock in India, to build a substantial following during the period 1940 to 1946. And the election results of 1946 gave the Muslim League authoritative position as well to represent Indian Muslims that Jinnah had long wanted. We find that how Muslim League was able to secure more votes and more seats in the 1946 election, and in the earlier election we find that how they were not successful. So they did not have that kind of a say. But in the 1946 elections, the large number of seats won by the Muslim League, it provided that kind of a say to them, and they also in a way had now greater confidence in their own ideas that they will be able to secure a separate homeland for themselves. So when we tend to compare the election results of the 1937 and when you tend to see the position of League in 1946, so it was a remarkable change in that sense, and the poor performance of the 1937 elections was a thing of the past. And now when you see that how in the present times League had done considerably well, and in 1937 when you tend to see that the poor results did not provide them some kind of an acceptance in the coalition as a coalition partner in the United Provinces. But in 1946 it was able to speak for the majority of Muslims who had right to vote at that point of time. So we find that this kind of a political scenario also benefited the League in the long run, and we find that League was ready to go all out in that sense. League was demanding a separate state for themselves, and for that it was also ready for the direct action, and we see it in the framework of the direct action day which was called by them. And they also communicated that the kind of situation which was unfolding in India, it was relating to a civil war kind of a situation, and the riots which were happening after the direct action day and during the direct action day as well. So they reflected the situation of the civil war. So we will talk further about the kind of aspects which are related to the communal politics and the partition of India in our next lecture. Thank you very much.